The gaming industry has had a lot of advancements in the recent years, from being able to play a competitive shooter while watching an hour-long documentary to being able to play pretty big open-world games all on a tiny phone. But surprise, surprise, there was a time when we couldn't do all that, okay? This is the time that some think is pretty close to the Dark Age, but if you add about 10 years, you'd land right around 1970 to 1980s, which is referred to as the golden age of gaming, or you can call it what some people refer to as video boom. And this was around the time that a lot of people wore exaggerated makeup and were obsessed with neon colors and triangles for some reason. I can't think of an 80s thing that doesn't have a bunch of neon colors and triangles for some reason. I guess they're obsessed with really futuristic things, but with futuristic things having like a lot of neon colors. And it didn't take long for home consoles to become so popular that it caused a large-scale recession in the video game industry. And you know what that meant? That a lot of rich people would end up losing a lot of money, you know, a lot of innocent rich people that just wanted to make a quick buck. You know, that's pretty sad. Now this large-scale recession was referred to as the video game crash of 1983. Now, that's a pretty cool name for something that in retrospect was the United States' fault for being greedy, but you know, it's a pretty cool name. We gotta victimize ourselves somehow, right? Now, this recession only affected the United States. Surprisingly, it didn't affect anybody else. And it's not a surprise because as much as the US loves its military, it also loves its money and having money-making ideas so that way it can make even more money. And now you're probably thinking, what could have caused this large-scale recession? What made all the fragile rich people start wearing barrels as clothes? Was it another Great Depression? Well, it was none other than your friendly neighborhood Atari 2600. And this little console was like Robin Hood, okay? It would bankrupt the rich in order for the poor people to game without having huge costs. Because, you know, history lesson here, if you guys don't know who Robin Hood is, Robin Hood was a guy that would go and bankrupt the rich, you know? Rich people would have these businesses where, I don't know, they would be selling corn and wheat, I guess, and Robin would be like an uptight guy, you know, he'd be like, "That's won't do, okay?" And he goes and he buys up all the corn. That way, poor people could also make businesses, and that would somehow bankrupt the rich people. And rich people would be like, "God damn it, Robin Hood! Not again!" Now, the Atari 2600 console was a trend starter, okay? Think of like high fashion trending. Like maybe, you know, someone in the high fashion might start wearing baggy jeans, so everybody else is doing the same thing. Or maybe they might start the trend to start thrifting, and now everybody else wants to go thrift. Atari was kind of like that. But instead of, you know, doing clothes and high fashion and all that, it actually started the trend of making arcade machines obsolete. The Atari 2600 was able to do this because in 1977, when it first came out, like out of the closet, there wasn't much competition because the gays knew that the Atari 2600, aside from having better graphics, being newer, and an overall hotter version of its predecessor, the Magnavox Odyssey, this console was revolutionary because it allowed you to switch game cartridges, and that is a big deal. And I mean, it wasn't the first to do that, but because Atari started licensing really popular arcade games like Space Invaders, and it became so successful in switching the whole game cartridges, it might as well have been the first to do so. You know, it's kind of like that effect where you say a joke and nobody laughs, but someone else more attractive and taller says the same joke and now everybody's laughing, and all they gotta say is, "Oh, it's because I said it louder." Yeah, it's the same deal, but with video game consoles. But with everybody riding this new wave of second generation consoles, because the first generation only allowed you to play games that were pre-installed, no longer were you tied to playing ping pong, hockey, and possibly the Oregon Trail. Probably not that one, of course. But now with this new wave, you didn't have to throw away an entire gaming console when you wanted to play the latest and greatest game. I'm sure that nobody did that, but given that we have iPhones and Androids that we throw away or trade away once the new one comes out, I wouldn't be surprised that people would do the same thing, but actually just throwing it away. That's probably why we have a lot of e-waste, a lot of centers that want to give people the opportunity to throw away their e-waste, but for free, I don't know. And with everybody getting hyped up with this Atari Shock, that was the name that the Japanese gave the video game crash of 1983. This was the start of the downfall of first generation consoles, which included the amazing Magnavox Odyssey and also, shocker, the arcade industry. And this downfall was kind of like a black hole because it also was the downfall of stores that were trying to profit off of arcade machines. The black hole just pretty much took anything that was related to video games at the time, because the whole popular thing around this time was the arcade machines, but now everybody was slowly transitioning into second generation consoles, so it just made a big financial mess, and a lot of people were just throwing away video games because they were no longer popular. And I mean, I do feel bad for, any store that was like a mom and pop store that lost a lot of money because of this, but there was obvious reasons why arcade machines just were no longer becoming popular. Why go and pay tons and tons of money to play Space Invaders when you have skill issues, when you can just do a one-time purchase and play Space Invaders in the comfort of your own home and have skill issues there? And a big one here, you weren't stuck playing the same 10 games over and over. Like, imagine having company over and the only form of entertainment that you have to offer is playing Candyland or Clue. It could get pretty boring pretty quickly, and those games are pretty much ass, and I like ass, but I don't like those asses. And another selling point for these second generation consoles was that you were sort of future proof, in the few years, that you would still be able to keep playing the games that were going to be newly produced. You didn't have to worry about throwing away a whole ass console just to play a new Space Invaders 2. You knew that the console that you got was probably most likely going to support that new Space Invaders 2. So this was a huge W for consumers, but a big fat L to anybody who was investing in the game industry, and also the unfortunate mom and pop arcade centers. But still, a W for the consumers. And of course, too much of a good thing ends up being bad, like having too much sugar makes you bigger, having too much alcohol makes you an alcoholic, and making too much money makes you a successful billionaire. So by the laws of obvious, which are obvious laws in the universe that are supported by relativity of the obvious, the US market started to piggyback off of the Atari 2600's success. And they started to mass produce shitty, half-ass second generation consoles. Like, for instance, we had the Commodore 64 game system, which was made by Commodore International in 1982. And this was a well-respected gaming industry, but they pretty much impaled themselves with a very large pull because they did the best kind of half-ass work, because they took their already successful games from their Commodore 64 home computer, copied and pasted the same code onto cartridges so that way they could be played on Commodore 64 game systems. And it might not be obvious to some people right away, but if you know a little bit about programming, you know that this is a recipe for disaster, especially if you made absolutely no changes whatsoever. Now, I'm a big fan of working smarter, not harder, and sometimes I do go on the internet and I copy and paste some code off of the internet and I don't even know how it works. I just need to finish this assignment, so I'll put it. But a lot of times I end up running into issues because I don't know what the hell I copied and pasted. So you kind of got to understand what the codes you're copying and pasting and how they work, or start from scratch, because then you're going to have issues. And that was apparent for the Commodore 64 game systems. Some of the games became borderline unplayable because at times the games would tell you to hit an F key, but the Commodore 64 game systems had controllers that only had like 2 buttons in the joystick. So a lot of the games, like I said, became unplayable. But for all the Commodore 64 fans out there who are diehard, don't worry. You guys' console wasn't the only one that was pretty shitty. There was another second generation console that was probably worse, and that was the 3DO interactive multiplayer that was made in 1991. And this was a console, but it wasn't. It was kind of like a riddle, you know? I am something that is a lot, but once people know about me, I am no longer. What am I? Now, this blueprint console was for other third-party companies to use and be able to make their own shitty half-ass second generation consoles, but with all the work already done. It's kind of like the same idea of a rich kid hiring a nerd to do an essay, but in this case, it was like a rich kid hiring their grandpa to write a economics paper on the current economic trends. And this console was an obvious failure because 1, the price point, and 2, because it was introduced to an oversaturated market that had a lot of second generation consoles. And if you weren't doing anything new in this industry, you weren't advancing some games, or you weren't, I don't know, putting 2 games at once, then you might as well have, packed it up and said, you know what, the gaming industry isn't for me. Pretty much had the same capabilities as any other gaming system, so it didn't have much to separate it from other consoles. And the funny thing from all of this happening and such is that all of this happened because of a single decision that Atari made in licensing, really popular games for their Atari and making their Atari, able to switch between games, using cartridges. And that was enough to break the whole first generation consoles and pretty much put them as obsolete, and that ushered in a new era of video game technology. So yeah, it sucks that one console pretty much made a massive financial destruction, but it's also pretty cool that one console did that much damage. But with all of that said, what do you guys think? Have any of you guys played the Atari 2600 or any of the consoles that I mentioned below? Do any of you guys still play arcade machines or go to any arcade centers? Let me know in the comments below. This is Stupid Takes. Goodbye and good night.